you. We will question relation of the arm's length bodies that fall under the remit of the treasurer. We will start with introduction before we'll go to the public hearing. Deputy Nagardiner, Chair of the Public Accounts Committee.
Deputy Karen Wilson, member of the panel.
Glenn Keogh, lay member.
Vijay Kikriya, lay member.
Deputy Raluca Kovac, member of the panel.
Philip Taylor, lay member.
And Ali.
Ali Yawan, lay member.
Thank you. And attendance of.
In attendance, Helen Thompson, Deputy CNAG, representing Lynn Pammont, the CNAG.
Thank you.
Richard Bell, Treasurer of the States.
Sebastian Perez, Head of Corporate Governance.
Steve Robinson, Head of Shareholder Relations.
Thank you. And we will start with the first theme, which is monitoring arm's length bodies, effectiveness and value for the money. Now, first question into...
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, Philip.
Morning.
Morning.
Can you just clarify for me which of the arm's length bodies and state-owned entities you're specifically responsible for overseeing?
The short answer will be that the Minister of Treasury and Resources is responsible for the shareholder functions of those states-owned entities. So that's fill in the blanks. On the majority earned basis, the Jersey Water, Jersey Electricity; on the wholly owned basis, Andium Homes, SOJDC, States Jersey Development Company, Jersey Post, Jersey Telecom, and Ports of Jersey.
Yeah.
In terms of wider ALBs, I'm not responsible as an AO for any of those, and indeed I'm not an ALO for the states-owned entity. I am charged with undertaking the shareholder function on behalf of the Minister for Treasury and Resources as the Treasurer of the States. In respect of wider good financial governance and wider corporate governance, of course, we are the Treasury, so we, through the various iterations of the Public Finances Manual, which sometimes feel like painting the fourth bridge, we are responsible for the frameworks, and of course in more recent times have been implementing recommendations, particularly from the CNAG, in respect of what the Public Finances Manual talks about in terms of arm's length bodies, including their definition. So I'm not responsible as AO for any of the arm's length bodies outside of state-owned entities.
Because those go down to the accountant officers in the various...
I would say they don't go down, they go across to those accountable officers.
Of course, yes. So as regards the state-owned entities, how do you actually fulfil those, what do you actually do, or your team do on your behalf, to fulfil those responsibilities?
So Steve does most of the hard work there. Stephen's a very small team with some budget for specialist advice as well. The relationships between Treasury and those entities, and indeed wider than that in terms of who the policy leads are for the sectors in which they operate, are set out in the Memorandum of Understanding. The Memorandum of Understanding have either been finalised or in the process of being finalised in certain cases. Further to recent review of those, they establish the expectations of us in respect of those entities and indeed what they might expect from the shareholder unit. There are, for example, in the case of remuneration, a policy that sits off the side of that and sets out the expectations of the minister in respect of setting remuneration, including base salary and incentive schemes for those entities. A key part of understanding what's happening in those departments is regular meetings, quarterly meetings at the very least. More often than that, you will find you have ad hoc meetings relating to things that are going to happen outside of those meetings. They are previously ministers of Treasury have delegated to their assistant minister, but with this particular minister, that minister takes the responsibility themselves for that and meets with Steve and those entities on a very regular basis. One step back up from that, I would say that the Minister has to agree the 5-year strategic business plan of each of those entities. That is usually a combination of agreeing with the Treasury and Resources Minister, but also the relevant minister in charge of the policy aspect. So in the case of Andy Holmes, that would be the Minister for Housing, for example. So those plans are agreed. The entities are then given licence to operate within those. If there are, for example, significant transactions outside of what's envisaged in those plans, then they need to come back to the Treasury for particular
So
approval.
policies are set out in the Memorandum of Understanding.
Yep.
The strategic strategy, 5-year strategies are agreed
Yep.
in terms of fulfilling those policies.
Fulfilling those expectations.
meeting those-
The policies will have to be.
I know, but
Policy-
in terms of, you have a strategy
Yeah.
to fulfil, to meet policies. And do you set out what the outcomes are you expecting?
So the strategic business plans, which are agreed from a policy perspective with the policy relevant ministers,
Yes.
and then approved finally by the Treasury Minister, sets out expectations, KPIs, objectives within those particular strategic aims of an organisation.
Can you
Yes.
give me an example of some of the KPIs?
So, for instance, just off the top of my head, Andrew Homes will have targets in terms of decent home standards, maintenance of that, modern facility standards, periods, vacancies, lets, and number of homes they'll be developing over the period covered by the strategic business plan.
And what happens if they're struggling to meet those outcomes, expected outcomes?
So at each quarterly meeting, the SOE board will be reporting to its shareholder, which would be the Minister of Trade and Resources, and usually a policy minister will be in attendance, and they'll be reporting on progress against those objectives. So if an organisation was meeting challenges, be it external, internal, or within government, those issues are flagged early on.
How would you describe the relationship, the relationship? Is it free and transparent, or is it acrimonious, or how does it work? I mean, are you best friends, or
I believe it is.
how would you describe it?
I believe they would describe it as open and transparent, and I would agree with them. We have regular dialogue, as the Treasurer mentioned. We have formal quarterly meetings, but we meet regularly with the CEOs and CFOs, where ad hoc projects, issues, challenges are raised in an open and transparent forum, with a view to, helping each other.
So it's a good relationship.
I would say so, yes.
And it's almost a team going together to meet mutual objectives.
Yes.
And so all these individual entities will have their own corporate governance arrangements.
Correct.
How do you satisfy yourself that they are being properly complied with?
I'll take that. So the MOU requires the SOEs to comply or explain with the principles of the UK Corporate Governance Code 2024. The principles are, I would suggest, rather than the provisions, full provisions, which are more relevant to a fully listed company. The principles set out your basic corporate governance standards. So through the there's a number of ways in which we look at this. One is we annually checklist against compliance against the MOU. The auditors, each SOE has its own auditors. They will sign off and look at how they've complied with the corporate governance code. So we're all over the governance of these organisations.
Board effectiveness.
And the MOU also talks about having, in accordance with the code, regular board effectiveness reviews. So annually, internally, every 3 years with an external resource.
Now, I've been on boards for many years, and I know these things never seem quite as well as they might do, as well they're supposed to. But we still get sign-offs from them because, in essence, they get done.
Yes.
But quite often there are difficulties on the way. Did you get alerted to these sort of governance issues that arise from year to year?
So I think the forum of having the regular cycle of board effectiveness reviews is an early indicator where there are potential issues. So, for instance, succession planning is always on the radar of both shareholder and the board. So when non-exec directors are coming to the end of their terms of office, the shareholders are alerted to that. Generally speaking, that if there was a recruitment campaign, that might trigger a board effectiveness review, which will look at the composition of the board, where there are perceived gaps in skill set, experience. So all those issues are regularly flagged on the agendas of quarterly meetings.
My final question before I pass back to the chair is, are there any particular ones of the SOEs that you may not feel comfortable answering this question, I'll ask it anyway, which you find they're struggling more than others for all variety of good reasons in terms of meeting their objectives that you set for them?
I think it's very difficult to say. I've been in post 5 years, and bear in mind I began this post right at the beginning of COVID.
Yeah.
So each of these organisations has had a very different journey, if you like, through the COVID experience. To cite one example, Ports of Jersey Airport Harbour shut on day one, and working with stakeholders to ensure connectivity on the crucial routes, medical and so forth. And obviously that had a huge impact on their finances. And working with them to regain some form of stability and grow in accordance with their original strategic business plan from 2019 has been a journey.
But where we are now, you've been through those journeys, you satisfied that all the SOEs are now working to their plan and meeting their objectives?
I believe they're doing their utmost. There are always store wins, be it interest rates for Andaman States of Jersey Development Company, cost of borrowing for ports with its investment in the harbour and airport. There are always factors sometimes outside the control of the SOEs. And I believe that having this regular interaction with them signals where there are challenges ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Before I continue with other, you said that when the change of non-executive happening, it might trigger board effectiveness review. You are 5 years in this position. How many and which board effectiveness review been taken?
So obviously I don't do that. Each board does their own board effectiveness reviews.
But you as a shareholder, you should be aware.
I should be aware of those. Yes, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. They happen routinely, and we often contribute to those reviews.
So you haven't been, because you have non-executive change, you said it might trigger a review of board effectiveness. So my question, has you as a shareholder know when review are taking place, or you don't know when review taking place of the board effectiveness?
We will be made aware when a board effectiveness review is taking place.
Okay. So are you remember any latest reviews that were taking place during your time? So which ones?
So, for instance, JT was the most recent one that we were involved in. Jersey Post have just done a board effectiveness review. So the board undertakes their own internal reviews.
But how they communicate, how you've been reported, and what's your involvement as a shareholder to be reassured that it's achieved its objectives, and what are concerns, what was raised through this review?
Okay, so just to be clear, the board effectiveness review is for the board. It's commissioned by the board, is for the board own knowledge. What they will do is they will invite the shareholder as a key stakeholder to potentially be part of that review. They will then, in accordance with the MOU, share the key themes from that review, and will explain what actions have come out of that effectiveness review, and then liaise with us in terms of those particular actions.
Okay, can you give one of clear examples of the latest review? Now you said Jersey Post. What came out from the review? What you've been updated? What's the next steps?
So obviously the board will have that detail, but I can tell you in high level terms, the Jersey Post and the JT Board of Excellence Reviews looked at the composition of the board and looked at, for instance, with JT, there is a requirement for a new non-exec director, and the chair is coming to the end of her 9-year tenure on the board. And therefore, the Board of Excellence Reviews looked at what skill sets would best serve the board in terms of a chair and a new non-exec director.
I mean, I know that we're not quite in the public listed area, but one would expect if there was a board effectiveness review carried out, the results of that would be reported in the annual report on accounts, and that would then be with a set of actions that the board had undertaken to carry out to meet any shortfalls. That's what would normally happen in the annual report. I can
In
understand
a
why it
fully
might not
listed
be
company,
publicised.
correct. In a fully listed company, correct.
Yes, and I know you're not a fully listed company. So the question I think the chair was, how do you find out about it? Do they tell you? Do they share the results with you?
Yes, yes. So the outcomes, the key conclusions are shared within the confines of a shareholder meeting, yes.
And their proposed actions.
Correct, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Could you just expand on that a little bit in terms of to what extent does the board review examine the effectiveness of the whole operations, as it were? You just alluded to the fact that you would be invited as a stakeholder around any change in personnel. But as a stakeholder, what else are you connected to or communicated with in relation to things like productivity, quality of service, financial management? Can you elaborate on some of those things for
I think
us?
it's fair to say just quickly, the board effectiveness review isn't about that. It's about the effectiveness of the board in its oversight of the entity in accordance with the code. Steve talked about regular reporting that we would expect in those quarterly meetings relating to those KPIs. That would relate to efficiency and effectiveness, but also in terms of customer performance, for example, which this minister is particularly keen upon in terms of customer KPIs as it relates to perhaps exec remuneration going forward. So the two things are different.
Okay, so what you're saying to us is board effectiveness is undertaken by the boards themselves, so they review their own effectiveness.
So two separate reviews. There's an internal review, commission, which the chair usually would undertake. So looking at these committees and how the board as a whole is working. And every 3 years, an SOE is expected to commission an external review. So a consultant will sit with the board, look at board papers, look at committees, actually sit in board meetings, shareholder meetings that we attend, and committee meetings to look at, is the quality of reporting appropriate? Are the committees working? Are the right members on those committees? That's strictly the board effectiveness review.
So it's very much a review of processes.
The operation of the board, I would say.
Yeah. Okay.
And you're sure that all SOEs boards done every 3 years external reviews?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Next question. What are the key risks SOEs are facing now? Can you give specific examples? What are the top risks on your risk register for SOEs?
So in terms of process, to explain the process first. So every quarterly meeting, the SOEs present their risk register with analysis of those key risks. Every 6 months, the SOE head of risk meets government's head of risk, and they have a conversation to review risk register reporting, and the head of risk looks at what risks that are at the SOE level that might be considered appropriate for the government of Jersey's risk register. But to your specific question about key risks, it's the usual ones like cyber risk, interest rate risk in those organisations. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I wasn't prepared for risks.
I mean, for example, for ASCO today, we have only 7 organizations. What are the top risks for Port of Jersey?
Cyber risk is a clear one. Economic risk.
What is economic risk?
Well, if there was, for instance, a recession, a deep recession that could impact passenger numbers and individuals coming through the airport and the harbour, freight levels would be down if islanders aren't buying maintains. It looks at its risks itself. Every 6 months and with regular interactions, the government head of risk will meet with the SOE and look at the risk register and look at what risks are actually on the SOE risk that should also be on the Government of Jersey's corporate risk register.
Does the, as regards to Jersey harbours and ports, does it include the risk of performance by the service providers, whether they're airlines or ferry companies, as to whether or not they are fulfilling their flight schedules, all of which, if they're not, could have a direct impact on the entity, but also on Jersey as a whole?
You'd appreciate, I'm sure, that Ports of Jersey's risk register is extensive. It's everything.
Oh, I know, but to me, that seems like a major risk.
I can assure you it is.
It's there, is it?
Yes.
Can I just pick up on the issue of forecasting? So in terms of your role as a stakeholder, how do you actually assure yourselves that things like forecasting around risks is right, is believable, is evidence based? Because we've got a scenario. If I talk about the visitor economy, the forecast originally was for 500,000 visitors to come to the island in 2024.
Through the sea.
And that was through ports, through the sea. But we've only actually got 272,000 people come through. And more than half of those are coming from France. I think our question is, how do you gain assurance on the forecasting models, in particular, in this particular instance, that Ports of Jersey have used? And how do you challenge some of these estimates? How do you, through your assessment of their risk register, through your discussions around their quarterly performance meetings, how do you challenge and what is your job as a stakeholder to actually sort of interrogate and inquire as to these issues?
I think just firstly, before Steve gets into any detail, we can't hope to be as expert across that wide range as they will be within their individual area of responsibility. We will consider, when we receive a strategic business plan for an entity that's supposed to straddle 5 years, and more specifically when we receive a proposal for a particular transaction that might not or does or does not include debt related to that particular transaction, we will give consideration to, and we'll definitely doing the latter, expert advice commissioned by Treasury in respect of either that plan or that particular transaction.
So what is that advice based on? How do you provide that advice?
How do we provide that advice? We generally commission advice from experts in the sector to look at whether that plan holds together, look at the key risks around that plan, sensitivity analysis, etc. And likewise for individual transactions, whether, for example, the most relevant one that's probably out there all the time is you'll have a new transaction coming through for a new development coming through from Andium Homes. Does the key risk there, of course, is whether they will receive sufficient rent to meet the debt servicing and debt repayment relative in respect of that particular transaction. So we will commission someone from the sector to do a piece of work to give us third-party advice rather than just relying upon the advice or the work from the SOE itself.
And how does that resolve in the sense that you've got a business plan with forecasting and some strategic objectives that have been identified, and then you've got an independent amount of advice that you've gathered? How does that result in a delivery plan that is actually, going to meet its objectives and meet its financial obligations?
It will have findings. It will have recommendations arising from it, and typically it might have areas relating to risk, and those will be fed back into the process of approving the business plan and may well see changes made to the business plan, or may well lead to rethinking a particular transaction.
And so it's just to come back to Philip's earlier question about relationships, and if there is a disagreement about the understanding of that position, what happens? How's
Well,
that?
ultimately, of course, if it were the case that the disagreement was too significant, then it wouldn't get approved. So you need to have an approved strategic business plan. I think there have been cases where we've had delay relating to those being approved and may have seen changes made, and in particular in respect for transactions, you may well see that changes have to be made, but the ultimate sanction would be not approving. You work together, right? Well, we have a amicable professional relationship. It's not always cosy and it's not always enjoyable. And I'm sure that's the case on both sides. We strive to maintain professionalism on both sides, and we'll no doubt strive in all cases not to quite achieve that. But there is a robust challenge, an often direct challenge, and probably understand that in some cases in the past, and I would say that's probably more so in the past than the future, that creates certain tensions.
And there's one challenge I can see, Ali. I'll just ask quick follow-up, follow the Karen, and Ali after will be with you. If you're going back to the challenge and the numbers that Karen quoted, and Deputy Wilson quoted, they came from the latest CNAG report on the critical infrastructure resilience. It's been reported. So in this one, I would like to understand if we are talking, Stephen, you talk about 5-year strategic business plan that has been approved by the Treasurer. When we looked at the strategic plan from the ports of Jersey currently, from 2024, 2023, where the rises numbers for touching 500,000 and above arrival through the sea. In 2024, it was 275, which is far away from 500. And we know that the current ferry operation, it will be likely to be less in 2025. And with introduction of ETA, new introduction of the permissions to get into the island for the French visitors, it's likely to reduce French visitors that were half of 275. Is it now the challenge, go back to Ports of Jersey, say, do you need to review your strategic plan, or numbers of arrival through the sea up to 500K are still relevant going forward for the next 3 years?
So obviously that conversation happens at the quarterly shareholder meetings. The passenger numbers through the airport and the harbour is a key element of the quarterly reporting that we receive, because so much is derived from that in terms of income and contribution.
My question, if this happened already, are they going to update their strategic plan? Because I personally cannot see in the next 3-4 years 500 plus K arriving through the port, through this harbour, not through the airport.
Of course, just to be clear, whilst the strategic business plan covers a 5-year period, that does not mean they only look at it every 5 years. So ordinarily, most of these organisations have a 5-year plan, but refresh it every 2 years, sometimes even
So
more.
would be published, updated the strategic plan?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Ali, to you, please.
Thank you. And just quickly on, you mentioned that you look at the risk registers for these companies. This is supposed to be a live document. So how often, what's the process when you identify a risk which should be on their business assessment? How do you communicate that, and how the companies do update that? So that's the first question. And secondly, have you performed like a gap analysis between your risk assessment and those companies' risk assessments as well?
So in terms of the first question, obviously you are quite right. The risk register is a live document. Clearly, if there was a immaterial risk added to an SOE risk register, I doubt it would be raised to our head of risk. If, however, there was a new identified risk of significant likelihood and impact, I strongly suspect that they would be contacting our head of risk to discuss that very point. And the similar conversation would have in the direction if our head of risk similarly identified a material risk? Is that on their risk register?
And is there an exercise to perform the gap analysis between, just to ensure that they are aligned, and how often we do that exercise?
That we can come back to you, but I think our head of risk would be responsible for that.
Challenging those meetings, because we will hear from different places. We just talked about it now, about our perception of risk and their perception of risk, and the aim would therefore to be a two-way dialogue. It's not just intended to be them sharing with us, we're supposed to share with them as well, and then therefore that would help that calibration.
So I'm assuming that the head of risk, when they have their meetings, say every 6 months, they do that kind of an analysis or gap checking, if there is any difference between both documents.
So the gap analysis will be in terms of those material risks which the head of risk feels that should be elevated to the corporate risk register. Yes, that happens.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think based on what's just been said there, Richard, you mentioned there's so much diversity. As a major shareholder, how do you know that you're getting value for money against all these key objectives that all these entities have?
That is a very good question, particularly in respect. It's far easier to look at that from the sense, and it's not, I suppose, I feel probably got a wider role there than just the shareholder function. You've got entities that are in a competitive market. The market helps with that in terms of understanding the value for money for customers. If you're not value for money for customers, your customer will go to your competitor. It's fair to say as well, in some of these entities where they are effectively monopolies, they will be subject to one form or another of regulation, usually relating to pricing, and that pricing will consider the cost base, but also consider whether perhaps there's an advantage that another entity that's not state-owned does have. We will see a key element of that in terms of value for money, in terms of the review of the strategic business plan. It's fair to say from time to time you get the opportunity that might arise by looking at similar entities in other jurisdictions, which might promote questions relating to, for example, cost base or margin. Some of these entities, one of the challenges we have is how comparable they are to a market elsewhere, or entities elsewhere. So there are very few, for example, entities that are combine the harbour with the airport in a single entity, but you can look at airport performance compared to airport performances elsewhere. That's not necessarily on a value for money basis, and sometimes that relates to airlines as opposed to airports. So we would be able to look at that when we're looking at the strategic business plan. That's where we employ sector experts to look at their business plans to inform us in respect of their plans.
Okay, Justin, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So drilling down into a little bit more detail, let's have a look at one example, Andium. How do you assure that that is delivering value for money in terms of providing affordable housing in particular? You have other benchmarks out there, you have local providers, and you have different providers from different jurisdictions. How do you drill down to establish that you are genuinely achieving value for money within Andium?
Well, so you're first be looking at viability of capital schemes. We spend a great deal of our time looking at the viability of capital schemes. There are a number of factors, and forgive me, I'm just remembering that you have a member on the panel that takes particular interest in the rental caps, for example, of Andium homes. So you will know from a value for wider stakeholder, rent levels, rent prices, comparison to market rents. You do acknowledge that Andium is by far and away and above the largest social housing provider on the island, but we would have crossovers that we could do in respect of Jersey Homes Trust. To look there to the extent that any of their financial information is available. But again, we would look, and we generally get involved at a transaction level basis on key developments by commissioning work of experts in those developments.
Okay.
Before Andrew, I want to ask
So
about Andrew.
I was thinking about Andium in particular for the time being, and we'll go on to some of the other entities in a moment. But so with Andium, I understand that there are external benchmarks. How often do you conduct that exercise? Is it just per development, or is there a periodic review?
But I expect that takes place during the development of the strategic
So
business plan.
each development is looked at in isolation. The strategic business plan is challenged when it's done every three years. The company itself has agreed KPIs within its strategic business plan, things like maintenance of decent home standard, achieving modern facility standard. I think outside of all that is the fact, if your success factor was the ability of the housing minister to widen the gateway because of Andium's delivery programme, that would I would suggest is a success factor.
Okay. So, and getting a little bit further into that, you mentioned that it's far and away the largest entity out there, and you have a great deal of responsibility in terms of setting the benchmarks for it and assessing them against other. How do you assure? How do you make sure that you're not distorting the market through the activities of Andium and preventing private industry from fulfilling some of those roles, perhaps more efficiently, as is typically the case?
I think maybe we're straying into policy. Obviously, the strategic business plan.
No, I don't think we are, because I suppose the question ultimately is, how do you assure yourselves that that is the right business model? How do you assure yourself that Andium is the right way to deliver the objectives, which are affordable housing, plentiful housing, high quality housing, etc.?
So that, I think what Steve is saying is that primarily relates to the purview of the Minister for Housing rather than the shareholder functions. And there has been a decision that we will Andium Homes, and we are charged with looking at their financial performance and their financial performance and good governance. So we will be, you're quite right to challenge it in terms of their value for money, for example. In terms of the wider is the provision of social housing best delivered through Andium Homes? We would get involved with that discussion. And indeed, if there were to be a proposal to widen the purposes of Andium Homes, then we would get involved in that discussion as well in terms of the plans for the future of the entity, in terms of its delivery against pretty much the purposes by which it was established by legislation. We'll see our function in delivering that.
Flip the question on its head in that case. What if it became clear to you that it was not an efficient way of delivering the objectives? In other words, that private industry could clearly supply some of the objectives more efficiently. What would your responsibilities be in that situation?
I think in terms of a wider role in government, as opposed to the narrow responsibilities relating to the good governance of the entity, is it in a wider forum of government? So in this case, that might be through the RSG,
Regional Engineering Group, yes.
which has political oversight in respect of some of the housing, more on the delivery arm. I think the question's a good question. It's quite probably one that best fits around, say, States of Jersey Development Company in respect of developments, as opposed to necessarily the provision of Andium Homes, and that's obviously a question at the heart of the future existence or not of SOJDC. Some of the stepping in related to SOJDC or its prior what's it called? Used to be Waterfront Enterprise Board, related to stepping into the failure of market at that particular point in time. It evolved over time to be about maximising return from state's land, for example.
But the question is how you avoid duplication if we're already going into this space. Because if you mention SOJDC, a completely Andium delivering social rent housing, fair enough, it's their remit. Saying this, Andium currently building affordable housing that they're selling, it's for sale. We have SOJDC that building houses, homes, flats for affordable for sale, because we know there is a 50-50, I don't know, different projects. But we have now Andium that building flats, houses for sale. We have SOJDC building affordable, not just private, open market houses for sale. And now we're hearing that Ports of Jersey going into the building accommodations, whatever sort of accommodation they will build. How we avoid, do we need these three entities delivering housing altogether or not? Have you considered duplications and how are you avoiding that they're not overlapping and what can be done?
So there have been probably a number of occasions, well, certainly if you're asking me whether I considered it, yes.
Okay.
And
What
in
you're
terms
doing
of
with
a direct answer to the question, in terms of there have been occasions where that has been considered in more depth across government, because of course we don't just sit on our own here, and I know that the current Chief Minister and the current Chief Executive is very keen to look at how you might deliver more efficiently through changing the structure, shall we say, of how those SOEs deliver, without being too specific about each of those. I think this features heavily in work that's previously been done, say, for example, in the role of JPH. So you have JPH, you have Andium Homes, you have in particular SOJDC in this regard, and then Ports. We are from time to time involved in those pieces of work, and those pieces of work are, from a high level perspective, currently being initiated across the ALB as well as states to look at how we might better deliver more efficiently. The theory is, and it's absolutely unquestionable, that the problem you have in Jersey is diseconomies of scale. Whenever you set up an entity, whether it be an arm's length body, whether it be a regulator, or whatever it be, or whether you're a States Department, for example, you're always challenged by diseconomies of scale. Having a model that's fit in purpose for a smaller island with a roughly 100,000 people might be that it's not the structure you would have in place if you were in a different location, and that's probably more relevant to ALBs rather than what you've seen over a period of time is invariably what I like to call from time to time, if I'm mischievous, nationalised industries might be better combined, particularly where they have areas of overlap.
So, I mean, there are models out there where a shareholder will look at duplication across their portfolio and say, well, actually, this is not a great way to deploy our capital, and insist on reorganisation. To what extent does your department have responsibility for identifying those duplications, and what processes does it use to move this into the policy sphere?
So we have the levers to be able to do that. Generally, these will be initiated further up the organisation because it's beyond shareholder. So we have the levers to be able to do it. It becomes an issue of whether they are the priorities of government at the time. It should not be underestimated the amount of work that would be involved in doing some of that. I was myself involved in corporations of both Jersey Telecom, Andium Homes, Jersey Post, and eventually that's transfer of undertakings from a department into a corporate entity, but those were years in the forming. It's not an insignificant piece of work. If we get to the point of deciding that they are the priorities of government, we would lead on those.
Thank you. So what activities, I'll try and speed up, but what activities do you undertake to assess whether they should be a priority? How do you establish the value of these exercises?
I'm trying to remember if we've got any in-depth piece of work done. I don't think we have in-depth piece of work. Most of those opportunities are fairly obvious in terms of what they might be, but we haven't commissioned in-depth work onto that.
So you haven't assessed the value potential, the opportunity on a regular basis. Okay, moving quickly on to other SOEs. How do you assess whether Jersey Electricity delivers value for money?
Delivers value for money for the shareholder.
No, for the island, but
For
shareholder
the
as
island.
well.
So
I
let's
think that
go
makes sense.
shareholder first, of course. Well, I'll go the other way around. Policy, of course, sits outside. So we will work with other entities. We will have. It's quite a different relationship between us and JEC in respect of listing rules and, in particular, protection of minority shareholders, which applies to other places as well. Be careful, I think I might have a former bolt over the JEC on your side of the table at this point.
Okay.
So we do have discussions with them when they're talking about increasing price rises, and in looking at that, we will work with the economics unit in looking at the rationale for those price rises, and in comparison with price per, what do we have, kilowatts? To in the UK sector, Guernsey sector and other places. So by comparison of that pricing compared to that pricing elsewhere, that's a fairly good indicator of value to customers.
Yeah, before we move to another, Glenn, just checking, is it any option that you can stay 10 minutes after 2? How's your
Hang on.
calendars, just to ensure where we are at?
Just let me, yep.
Yeah, okay, Glenn.
Okay, yeah, so based on all this wealth that's been made, all the revenue that's been generated now, at what point and how do you provide approval for the I can never say this word, I apologise, for remunerations and bonuses for the executives across the entities?
So we it's covered firstly primarily within the MSU.
MOU.
Well, the MSU is something else completely, isn't it? MOU. And through a policy that's appended to the MOU in respect to the expectations as to how remuneration should be set by boards and the instances in which that is needs to be either notified or approved by the shareholder. In terms of the work that's done, we will expect that there are expectations put in place by the shareholder and in particular by the minister as to what should be borne in mind when setting remuneration. The board will commission a piece of work that might look at relative pay in the sector elsewhere and on Jersey or in Jersey. We will then, should we need to commission our own work, to look at that as well.
So those levels are assessed and compared to other jurisdictions of similar ilk? Or we just accept what they say and go with it?
I'd say remuneration is probably one of those areas of the most lively discussion, if I can put it
Hence
that
why
way.
we're asking the question.
Between us and the board at that time, so they will produce their piece of work, we will commission our own piece of work should we need to, and challenges will be put in place. That typically twofold, one on base salary, secondly on incentive schemes. The framework for incentive schemes has to be approved by the shareholder as well. And as I said earlier, one of the minister's priorities is to make sure that customer feedback is adequately considered within the framework for those incentive plans. So the framework is approved, and then we would expect the entity to tell us how they've arrived at a particular year's payment for that entity. Sorry, for that executive.
Okay.
2 quick follow-ups. first of all, how do you know how they benchmark? Because in the previous, unless it's changing a remuneration framework, they need to benchmark, but it's from the government, but it doesn't say how. So would they benchmark to the utilities company, for example, on the island, which is several sites, or they will benchmark towards the UK? Are you checking their benchmarks? Or now we will have more clear benchmarking direction?
It will differ depending upon the entity. Of course, you should be looking at housing associations in the UK or elsewhere if you're looking at remuneration for the executives surrounding homes, for example, rather than electricity companies in Guernsey.
No, what I mean, for example, if Jersey Electricity and remuneration would be look around the Jersey Water and remuneration Jersey Electricity in Isle of Man, or housing provider on similar sized jurisdictions, because obviously Jersey Electricity.
So our challenge, these are generally sector related. Please correct me if I go wrong.
But do we
They're
have
generally
similar size benchmarking or not?
This is the challenge. The challenge is coming up with organisations that are comparable. And I drew your attention earlier to there are very few entities that have a harbour and an airport in them. And there are very few entities that have a harbour and an airport in them with a population of 100,000 and a different number of customers. So we'd expect that benchmark to include different, as close as you can get to what they understand to be the remuneration in similar sized entities, or as similar as you can get it. We were then, and there's another arching addition within the MOU,
Yep.
that, and I can't remember the phrase, not losing sight of the fact the entity is a state-owned entity.
It's interesting that you mentioned ports, that like it's hardly any jurisdiction running ports, airports, harbour and the airport at the same time. But we know, like in the UK, most of the airports now, even they're strategic, they're in the private, run by the private companies.
So
Have any comparison been done? Do we still need the states-owned 100% shareholder and having all responsibilities on the public money, or it more efficiently can be run by the private company like in the UK? I don't know, I'm just challenging. I'm just asking question just because you mentioned this.
Sorry, is your question, do we ever consider whether we should sell state-owned entities?
Yeah.
Was that the question?
No, my question was very similar, different one. In the UK, where she mentioned different jurisdiction, the airports run by the private companies.
Yeah.
And the risks and management, and obviously they are regulated. We have state-owned entity that run in the airport, considerable cost. Was the cost considered, and what will be?
So this is the tension, and this is the difficulty in agreeing the level of remuneration. What you want to be able to do is to attract high calibre quality individuals to run those operations. That means when you're competing in the marketplace for jobs that those people could do otherwise, you're inevitably looking at what their alternatives of work are. Once they're here and you have a review of that, you might start to go, well, they're here, what's the justification for the increase? And that might relate to flight risk. And I'm not saying flight risks at airports, I'm saying flight risk of the chief exec or the finance directors. That becomes part of the equation. It's always going to be a balance relating to paying sufficient to attract the quality of individual we need to have on board to run those entities. Mm-hmm. When you're fishing in the pool where perhaps all of the other comparables are private sector elsewhere, against the risk profile relating to this particular entity on the island. That's what you're all constantly trying to get a balance of from the shareholder's perspective.
Before we move into periodic review, I'm just looking around the table if it's any follow-ups on this part.
I've just got one,
Yeah.
If I could, Richard. Are there any, you asked the chair the question about whether we would consider selling states entities. I mean, is that a recommendation that a shareholder can make if it finds that it's not delivering value for money?
The approach I generally take, or I would generally take as the shareholder, is to say, why is government owning the entity? That's the challenge, and often there are very good reasons why government would. That indicates that I think there might not be good reasons in certain cases. But there are very good reasons in a small island economy why you may have a state-owned entity. Ultimately, that decision is an assembly decision. It is not a minister's decision. It would take a proposition of the minister to bring it forward. There are entities within the portfolio that I'm sure it would be potentially, I just got a message on my phone saying the chief executive's calling me. I hope he's not watching. That you could say, you could identify that potentially lend themselves potentially to be divested. If you find yourself sitting there with one of these entities and you realise the only reason you're actually earning it is as an investment, then when I look at our investment strategies, we don't generally hold 100% of entities. We hold very small amounts of entities in our wider investment strategy. So that's where the challenge, I think, comes. But there would be very good reasons in the marketplace or the sectors that they're in why you would not, in a small island jurisdiction, sell those entities.
And does this come down to government's appetite for risk in relation to what risks there may well arise if those entities were to be sold off, as opposed to maintaining or carrying the risk, an acceptable risk, if you chose not to?
Yeah. The risk comes into that. And you see our ports. In particular, I suppose you would look at that through a risk lens in terms of security of freight, provisions, safety, etc.
Okay.
Yep.
I've got two questions. I think they'll be relatively brief. Hopefully we're getting brief answers.
Am I taking too
You'll
long?
have your own risk appetite as regards some of these state-owned entities in terms of the way they operate, the performance they deliver. So what do you do? At what point do you step in? Do you know when you would step in, shall we say, when they're operating self-evidently beyond your risk appetite? And that could be because the service levels are so bad, we've no longer got telecommunication services, the water's full of sewage, or whatever. Do you know when you would actually step in and say, this isn't working? Or advise ministers that we should be stepping in and saying, this is not working?
I step in. I hope you're not suggesting take over running the company.
Well, you may have to, yes.
But you may have to.
You may have to.
That would be the case. I think there's a wide spectrum there, isn't there? That might be because you might have seen instances where the governance isn't quite what you would have expected, and there have been instances of that where we would have meetings outside the quarterly meeting to make those views known.
Yeah, you no longer trust the management. They're not telling you the truth. It could be.
Well, yes, so those are slightly different to the operational risks relating
Well,
to
it affects the operations.
Well, it does affect it. So I can say that there have been instances where that happens, okay? Where you might have a number of different instances of things that make you feel a bit uncomfortable. You therefore would have a meeting with the...
And you
might have a meeting with the execs, you might have a meeting with the chair, depending upon what that might be.
And you could step in and take action.
Yes. And,
Okay.
well,
that's the answer I want. It's fine. Then finally, many of these entities were set up for a specific purpose some years ago because they was felt that was the best way to provide telecommunication services, ports and harbours, post office through the entities been set up. The world changes, different methods of operations change. Have you considered reviewing the structures you've got in place to satisfy yourself that these are the most appropriate ways to deliver the services for the island community?
So, back to
I think this is somewhere
back to this
where we were trying to
particular
get to.
I think it's fair to say that it's fairly high up on the agenda for current government to look at some of those structures. I think given the amount of work it would be to do that, you'll
Yeah.
expect that would be, can you look at, Richard, the following, and I'm expecting that would be the case. The wider piece of work that might look, I know it more relates to other arm's length bodies, but it also includes, have we got optimal structures in respect to those entities?
I mean, it could be
Are they
that you,
combined, or are we clear whose responsibility? Who should be doing what? It's fair to say, back to the point you make in respect of construction, we were a large minority of the market. We're now the majority of the market.
I interjected and I shouldn't have done.
No, this is just in the interest of time because we have a few other subjects to cover. So in relation to periodic reviews of arm's length bodies, from the letter we received from the CEO on the subject, we understand that all the ongoing informal oversight of initiatives and partnerships are being carried. Very few formal reviews are actually undertaken, though. So what periodic reviews of the arm's length bodies under your remit have been carried out in the past 5 years?
So we do that review in terms of the strategic business plan, but the Public Finances Manual specifically excludes SOEs from that requirement. In respect of structured reviews, the question indicates that probably relating to more structure, should we earn them,
Yes.
etc. So I have been involved in questions in the past relating to whether we should continue to earn them. I've been involved in discussions relating to who should do what and should we change those structures. The benchmarking we would do in terms of their performance, but in terms of structured review that you're getting into in here that says, for example, is Andium Homes the way that we should deliver affordable housing, in particular social housing, in the future? There's been no review I'm currently aware of.
So how do you actually decide when a structured review is needed and who's responsible for leading and signing off such reviews?
So currently there isn't a regular process in place by which that would occur. That's more as a result of work that you might have done that might tangentially or incidentally lead you to start considering whether you might make recommendations as to the current ownership of that or the current structure of it. And as I said, there are pieces of work that have been talked about doing in terms of the overlap between JPH, Andium Homes and, not Andium Homes, SOJDC in particular.
And what do you see as the risk of not carrying out more structured reviews?
What's the what?
The risks.
The list.
Risks. Risk.
List. Is there a
Risk of
list?
not
The
getting
risk of not carrying out.
No. Is there a list of ones we
No, the risk.
Risk of not doing
Yes.
them? I would say that the risk of not doing them would be to say that you, in particular, might not have the most efficient and effective way of delivering those services or products that they deliver.
And the issue preventing more regular reviews of these bodies are mainly resource capacity or policy driven.
Well, I would say that commissioning those reviews in a meaningful way would be a not uncostly exercise if you were to do them in a meaningful way. You have to know that there would be the appetite to see them through if that's what you the outcome of it were to be. I don't know what we do if we started doing that once every 5 years plus. you started on a rota, we probably need a bit more resourcing within the Treasury to do so, if that was the question.
And what plans do you have currently to conduct structure reviews and of which bodies? How do you prioritize what's coming next in structure?
So we have this, as I said, we don't currently have a programme of structured reviews that look at whether we should continue earning or whether we should, there's no ruling programme, as it were. That will depend upon priorities of government in any particular year. We will and do review on a rota the strategic business plans because they typically have a life of 5 years. So they are a live document, as it were. They will be updated annually or when needed, but that would be where our effort would be in reviewing the plans of any of those entities for the next coming years.
Okay. We also note that no review has taken place of the State of Jersey Development Company since its formation in 2011, despite multiple recommendations. Why is this case, and how you're assuring yourself of the organization's effectiveness?
So I think that that was answered in a letter from the Chief Executive, that ultimately that won't be a decision of the RSG to do so. And currently government is prioritising outcomes and delivery by the entities by that particular entity rather than the review that was envisaged in that particular scrutiny report.
And in the absence of a formal review, how do you ensure a strategic overview and that their activity is indeed in line with the strategic objectives of the Council of Ministers?
So that would be through their strategic plan review, and in the case of SOJDC in particular, would relate to individual transactions that are before us or individual developments that are before us.
And equally, given what you said before of the possible duplication work with the SOJDC, Andim and such, do you agree a review is overdue for States of Jersey Development Company, and if so, when it might happen?
I think that it would be worthwhile undertaking a review that looks at whether we might better structure who does what from a corporate governance structure, so corporate perspective. For example, JPH versus SOJDC. I know that it becomes a priority every now and then of government to do, but in respect of the particular recommendation that related specifically that came out of that review, that is determined by the priorities of government in any particular term of office.
Yeah, last question.
And just to say, the part of your question as well was, we do have a responsibility to constantly be looking at their effectiveness, but that's not to say I don't think that there's merit in having a review of those structures in the future.
Last question, and we'll wrap up. Karen.
Okay, thank you. Treasurer, I just wanted to ask you through what lens you would conduct that review. Would that be through an investment lens, a policy lens, or something else? Because I would imagine that there would be different outcomes depending on which way. What's your preferred approach?
It's both. So when we get to the point of there might be good reasons. We talked about filling a hole in the market. The driver for doing in particular the IFC build through SOJDC or Waterfront Enterprise Board as it was at the time, it would be through both. Ultimately, it would be outcomes for islanders, and part of that might be investment or cost efficiency, and part of that will be policy.
So you will choose for each entity a different approach depending on what gives a better outcome for islanders.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for extending time. And public hearing is closing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.